Today we're going to discuss some of the common criticisms of Hutton's parries. This video was inspired by a post from Russ Mitchell, who recently posted his own video criticising Hutton's parries, particularly in Cold Steel. Now Russ isn't the only one to have raised these particular points about Hutton, but we'll be using his video as the basis of our exploration. And I want to be very clear. This video is not a criticism of Russ, nor his scholarship, nor fencing ability. On the contrary, Russ has contributed a great deal to the fencing community, including the translation of a number of saber manuals. This is one of my own copies of one of his translations, which I highly recommend. I'm also not intending to criticize in any way the other fencer in this video who assisted Russ. Importantly, this video is also not a claim that Hutton's system in Cold Steel is the best system of saber. I would contend that it's a fine system of saber and it's quite accessible, but we'll get into that later. However, we will be addressing a number of items from Russ's video. Specifically, we'll look at the methodology used to demonstrate the assertion that Hutton's system is ineffective. What we're really looking at is the evidence, the way the evidence is presented, and a reliance on static demonstration rather than practical implementation. To test Russ's assertions, we're going to approach his arguments in good faith. To do this, we're going to use heavyweight swords, we're going to be attacking with speed and intent, and while the other fencer in the video has been told what technique they should be using, they've not been told why we're doing it. So it's a kind of very simple blind trial. So let's get started, and first we'll be looking at Tierce. The hypothesis is that Tierce as demonstrated by Hutton is weak and ineffective. This is accompanied by the only practical demonstration in the entire video. And of course, the guard fails.
Well, shit.
Well, I guess that's case closed then. Or maybe we should take a closer look at the structure here. Notice the position of Russ's arm. His elbow is pulled right back behind his body. This is going to make it much more structurally weak than a slightly advanced elbow as shown in the image. Ironically, Russ is well aware of this, because shortly afterwards he demonstrates,
This is great.
and I agree, this is a pretty good guard position. In fact, it's almost exactly the same as Hutton's guard position. Let's confirm that. The red line indicates the leading edge, so let's flip that onto Russ. The conclusion is clear here. Russ actually advocates for the guard position that Hutton is using, at least in this case. There is another issue though, and it's much more significant. We're not following the instructions here, which are to receive the cut on the fort as close to the shell as possible. This lack of opposition of the strong causes the blow to land mid-blade, and with that arm structure, it collapses. I think what might be going on here is that static guard positions are being conflated with parrying actions. Here are the three positions of Tierce shown in Cold Steel. Notice they all exist along a continuum, and are not meant to be used statically. Our wrist and elbow move from the very low position close in, swinging forward and up along these lines to the high position. The angle of incidence of the attacking blade is in between the mid position and the high position, so we have to adopt an intermediate position between the two, with our hand lifted and our elbow slightly forward. We shouldn't be surprised then that very similar positions are seen in French manuals from the era, with French obviously being an influence on Hutton. Now we need to test this hypothesis. Now remember, my opponent hasn't been told specifically what they're trying to demonstrate, just to parry and Tierce. Notice they're naturally lifting the shell and the fort, and they're keeping the arm slightly in front of the body, and it's quite effective. Perhaps then the problem is that we're not hitting hard enough, so let's increase the intensity with these 800 to 850 gram swords. And once again, even with sparks coming off of the blades, the guard does not collapse as demonstrated in the original video. And even while I'm trying to keep the elbow back like Russ is behind his body, we're not seeing significant deflection of the blade that causes a risk to the defender. And at the more polite fencing levels you might see in competition, this guard, as demonstrated by Hutton using the shell and the fort and bringing the hand slightly upwards, is entirely effective against both cuts and thrusts.
Go, Josh.
Now let's look at a similar set of criticisms levelled against the position of cart.
Here.
Laughter and grimacing, so it must be terrible.
This is a bad structured parry.
For a badly structured parry, it certainly seemed unusually popular for fencing instructors at the time. Interestingly, later in the video, Russ actually asks one of his students to parry in 4.
Actually, I'm going to cut 5, and I want you to parry in 4, okay? Bang!
I'm not critiquing the other fencer here, but isn't this exactly the guard Russ tells us not to use in the cart section of the video? Their goal doesn't seem to be to emulate Hutton's cart, and they fall into this position at least twice during the video quite naturally, suggesting this is a fairly normal position for them to be in. But this is an unscripted video, so this could be something that just happened in the moment. So we have an assertion with no clear evidence yet, so we'll have to test for ourselves. Let's see what happens when we perform a higher intensity attack with a relatively heavy saber. With the opponent lifting his shell and fort, even against heavy attacks, it's effective. So much so that it's my sword that's bending around his. Now let's look at some more polite sparring video. Once again, no evidence that the position is ineffective. The assertion that both Tierce and Cart are poorly structured doesn't seem to be supported by the evidence, so let's look at another guard.
Low preem.
A quick aside, there's a lot of laughing at guard positions in the video, and it could be for two reasons. First, the system isn't being taken seriously. This takes away from the presenter's credibility as it shows their own inherent bias, and leads us to suspect we're being presented with a straw man. Or it could be that it's a rhetorical device to cue to the viewer that they're not meant to take it seriously. Either way, it's extremely distracting.
We haven't scripted any of this. Tell me what's wrong with this as a defense against cut 3.
Where do I start?
Give me one good example.
First of all, I have your flat.
So the hypothesis is that it's again structurally weak, but the blow shouldn't be falling on the flat. Our edge is to the front left, so it'll be on the edge, specifically at the fort, near the shell. Perhaps then another experiment is in order. First, let's test the position against regular intensity cuts. Against polite attacks, it seems pretty much rock solid. Even when we increase the intensity, the guard doesn't fail at all. So with this first criticism failing, let's look at the second.
Okay.
Second of all,
Okay. Do you have a third? Yeah, I'm in danger of being disarmed. Roman is absolutely correct.
The problem seems to be that the opponent can continue to advance to thrust around or to disarm us. While this is possible, it's generally only a risk if the defender stands statically after the initial attack. If we follow Hutton's instructions and immediately attack with a return of our own, it's much less likely to happen. The opponent charges forward, attempting to grab the wrist. The outcome, getting cut in the head, is something that's seen quite often in sparring and in competition situations. So with that criticism thrown into question, let's move on to High Octave, which seems to draw particular attention from Hutton detractors. The opponent is parried, and then riposts, and Russ lifts his arm. Seems perfectly reasonable, but look at the difference in the structure. Russ's elbow is far forward of his sword compared to the picture of Hutton. This is a genuine problem. An experienced opponent would simply skip backward and cut the exposed elbow on the way out.
Kat is not acting. She has never seen this before. Oh, that's wrong. That's bad. That's terrible.
Wrong, bad, terrible, and quite the joke. Perhaps we need to explore this claim further. Now, many people also have additional complaints about the structure of High Octave, so let's test that as well. So far it's effective, so let's add the return. Also effective. In fact, High Octave is showing no indication of being bad, wrong, or terrible. In this last sequence, we see a parry in Cart, a parry in High Octave, and a parry in High Tierce. Variations on all three of these guards drew criticism in the original video for being ineffective, yet here they seem to be working quite well. We also see High Octave appear organically during sparring, as these videos demonstrate. A final note on this entering action. This can be extraordinarily dangerous if your opponent is not standing statically as Russ is here. If they're performing an immediately return with a high cut, there is a danger, particularly if the hand is this far up on the shoulder where it can't prevent movement, of the shell or the fort coming over and hitting directly on the top of the head. It won't happen every time, but it is a risk, so it's something to consider. We'll see this when we overlay the two videos shortly. The cut on the return offers significant risk of being hit by the shell or the fort, and I've seen this happening in sparring with some unpleasant outcomes. Throughout the course of our exploration, we found that the accusations levelled against Hutton's guard positions were not well founded. When we performed the techniques as instructed in the original text, we found that they worked quite well. Furthermore, we found that they were corroborated in many cases by other texts from the same era, and the criticisms levelled by Russ seem to be largely a result of the bias he brings to the reading of Cold Steel, rather than from the text itself. Finally, and importantly, this is not a criticism of Russ, his fencing, his scholarship, or the other fencer in the video. Neither is it saying that Hutton is the best system there is, particularly in Cold Steel. However, we do find it to be a system that's fairly simple, fairly effective, and quite accessible for beginners, and that the criticisms levelled against it are not well founded. And there you have it. Thanks for watching.